Hello viewers, thank you for joining me, and Happy New Year! There should be a couple changes to this channel this year. The big one, and for anyone who has been around, I promise this is the last time I'll announce this, is that the series I review at the start of each month will be decided by a poll from now on. If you're watching this, then the poll for February is already live and will remain up for the first 3 days of the month. So please feel free to check out my community tab to see what's on the table for next month. This series was not decided by poll. I wanted to start the year off strong, and I don't think I've ever heard a bad word about Violet Evergarden, so I've been saving this one. Violet Evergarden is the tale of a young girl who was raised to be an emotionless tool for the country of Leidenschaftlich in their fight against the Garderic Empire. At least, until she was given to Major Gilbert Bougainvillea, who both gave her her name and did his best to get her to embrace her emotions when they weren't on the battlefield. But after 4 long years, our story begins with the war's end. Violet is adrift at the start, having lost both Major Gilbert and her arms, which have been replaced with pretty impressive prosthetics for a world that's otherwise not terribly technologically advanced. In the final battle, she's not sure how to go on without someone to give her orders. So she's taken in by Gilbert's friend, Lieutenant Colonel Hodgins, who was quick to retire from the army once the fighting stopped. He gets a bit of flack for that from some of the other characters throughout the series, as you soon learn that the peace treaty hasn't even had its official signing ceremony yet, and there is a faction of the Garderic army still causing trouble, trying to start the fighting back up again. But if Hodgins comes across as a little soft-hearted, it's in a very likable way. He doesn't really have the disposition for a soldier, but he did his part. He never came across as cowardly. Maybe his character would have a different feel if this was still a war story like I'd originally thought it was. There is still plenty of action, and not just in flashbacks, but it is very much a post-war story. Its main focus is on the country and its people trying to settle back into peace and come to terms with what they've lost. In light of that, Hodgins has started up a postal company, employing a handful of auto-memory dolls, which feels like a bit of a misnomer. The dolls are human. They transcribe letters for people who are either illiterate or just don't feel up to the task themselves. I think the point of calling them dolls is meant to show that they are also tools in a way, but at the same time they have the most human job possible. More often than not, their clients don't know exactly what they want to say. A skilled doll is someone who can listen to what they are saying and interpret what they actually mean, so that their feelings come across in the letter. Violet is immediately drawn to the job upon hearing the head doll reading back a love letter she wrote for one of her clients. Shortly before the final battle, Gilbert told her he loved her. And now she's determined to learn what the words "I love you" truly mean. So she begins training to be an auto-memory doll, despite initially being wildly unsuited for a job that requires emotional intelligence, and then goes on to travel all over the continent to meet with clients, briefly stepping into their lives and their struggles, and learning a little more about herself with each letter she writes. Where to start with an overview of this series? I promised myself I would try to limit the number of times I used the word beautiful in my own review, because that is by far the most common descriptor I've heard when others were trying to describe it, and sometimes that just doesn't feel like enough. But I could see why that had been the case as soon as I started up the first episode. Visually, this anime is breathtaking, and that wasn't something that wore off for me over time. The music was pretty great overall, too. There were a couple moments where it felt a little overbearing, swelled so drastically that it practically drowned out the conversation the characters were having. But that wasn't something I noticed after the first 2 or 3 episodes, so I'm content to write it off as part of the learning curve. The story is a little more difficult to talk about. I have to admit, I was a little surprised at first that all the feedback I heard about this show had been so unanimously wonderful, because it gets off to kind of a slow start. Violet's adventures with her early clients are fairly episodic, not affecting much more than her personal growth over time, which I know isn't for everyone, myself included a lot of the time. Each story handles some pretty heavy topics, but the pacing is laid back. The war is already over, after all, at least until the conflict with the anti-peace faction picks up in the second half of the series, a change I was completely on board with, even if I have found an appreciation for slower stories over the years. I want to make it clear that I'm not surprised that anyone who gave this show a chance, even after a slow start, fell in love with it. I feel like I had a more specific roadblock I had to overcome. This tale of someone who's had their humanity beaten out of them learning to feel again is a moving concept even without getting attached to a specific character. For quite a bit of this show, I felt like something was missing. At first, I thought my expectations might have just been impossibly high. That's always a concern whenever I go into an anime with a really great reputation. As the series went on, and I acknowledged that there really weren't many objective faults I was finding with it, I decided the issue was actually just that my own experience with anime has been oversaturated with this kind of character story. I can think of 3 or 4 just off the top of my head without even going into characters who overcome an emotional deficit because they're literal robots or AI, something that's pretty much a staple of sci-fi storylines at this point. I know I've said before that the same idea can be done well multiple times, but after enough of them, a new entry really does need something extra to make it stand out. That's the only conclusion I can reach whenever I start to feel like this series was just a little bit of a letdown. Because when I do my best to judge it without comparing it to anything else, any complaints I have feel like they're about very trivial things. Violet Evergarden really is a great story. I was impressed by how much I could see Violet growing over time, getting a little more emotionally attached to each client. It was a nice payoff to that slower pacing in the beginning. I really liked seeing more and more flashbacks to the war as the fighting threatened to break out again in the present day. I would have liked to see more world building. All we're really given as a motive for the war is that Leidenschaftlich had some resources the Garderic Empire wanted, but we're talking precious metals, not like farmland needed to keep their people from starving. I just found it a little hard to believe that anyone would be against peace after 4 years of warfare, unless the living conditions were really bad. But again, not a war story. A post-war story. Understanding that changes the priorities a little. There was one place this series made me genuinely emotional. I feel like that's another distinction I have to make. While the whole story is moving, it didn't make me emotional most of the time. I went into this one expecting it to be a real tearjerker, and, well, I feel like there has to be some level of surprise to elicit that sort of reaction. A good twist can do a lot for a show's overall emotional impact. And it was pretty clear how Violet's story was going to play out by the end of the first episode. Now, I definitely want to talk about that one moment that was really special for me, as well as a twist at the end that I want to speculate about, but one of those is absolutely a spoiler, and the other, while it might be a stretch to call it a spoiler, I would feel like I was spoiling something. Not so much a specific event, but an important sentiment that ties it all together at the end. I like people to be able to make that choice for themselves, whether they'd rather see it firsthand before hearing about it from someone else. So we've reached the part where I tell you that Violet Evergarden is absolutely worth your time if you're interested in this premise and haven't seen it yet. I feel like my review has been a little lackluster in talking it up. I hope I've managed to communicate that anywhere I wasn't totally blown away didn't really feel like the fault of the show itself. In a vacuum, its story and characters and their growth are all really great. It's possible I've just seen this idea done one too many times. And this won't be the last time I talk about it either. As well as the 13-episode TV series, Violet Evergarden also has 2 movies, a special episode, and a recap episode. I skipped the recap, and I plan to watch both movies and cover them in a review later in the month. I understand one of them to be the canon conclusion to this tale, and I guess we'll just have to see the significance to the other one. I have actually already seen the special, and I wanted to bring that up specifically for anyone who's going into this blind who wants to have the whole experience. I watched the special after I'd already finished the rest of the series, but I'd suggest watching it when you're about halfway through. It doesn't spoil anything or affect the story in any way. It's literally just an extra episode, but it clearly takes place while Violet's still in the early stages of learning to comprehend emotions, so it was a little off-putting to watch it at the end, like stepping back in time to a past that you probably won't be nostalgic for. Violet is unquestionably better off at the end of the tale. With all that out of the way, now we are about to head into spoiler territory. You have been warned. The moment that made me unexpectedly emotional near the end was actually the scene that redeems Gilbert's brother, that argument on top of the train that reveals that Dietfried is also grieving for Gilbert, and the reason he hates Violet so much is because he can't come to terms with the fact that she survived when Gilbert didn't, possibly because it was her job to protect him, possibly because it seems unfair when he was such a good person and she was practically an emotionless machine at the time it happened. They don't go that deep into it, but it was not a redemption I was expecting, or even particularly wanting. From the moment you meet him, Dietfried is kind of just a dick, to put it simply. I certainly didn't get the impression from the flashbacks that the brothers were as close as their mother later claims. I wasn't attached enough to care about a redemption for Dietfried, or so I thought until it happened. I don't know what to say except that the lines where Dietfried finally breaks had so much raw pain and emotion behind them that I couldn't help but feel something in return. And the real cherry on top is that Dietfried finally accepting Violet as part of their family, like Gilbert had wanted, really helped to reinforce a big point they started trying to make near the end, that the positive impact you have on the people around you can be just as long-lasting as any damage you've caused. As far as themes go, that was my biggest takeaway from this series, and something truly deserving of being called beautiful. But if you're already familiar with the series, that's probably not the moment you are expecting to hear about. In the anime's final moments, Violet receives a request from a client who asks for her specifically, and we don't get to see who opens that door, but she gets an expression on her face that says it all. The client can only be Gilbert, whose body was never actually found. He's been presumed dead all this time because frankly, there's no story that makes sense for how he could have possibly gotten away with the injuries he had, and why he wouldn't have gotten in touch with any of his friends or family in all this time even if he had survived. But logistics aside, honestly, I'm not on board with this twist. The movies have got their work cut out for them if this is what they're going with. It wouldn't be the first story that ruined itself by trying to shoehorn in a happier ending at the last second. Sometimes letting your characters learn to live with their tragedies is the more satisfying conclusion. There is one way this twist could work. This is kind of the reason I wanted to write this review before I'd seen the movies. I want to get my speculations out there while I'm still blind. While watching the series, I spent a lot of time ruminating on that feeling of something missing in the storytelling. That special something that could make this one stand out from all the other stories like it. And I think it did accomplish that with the reconciliation with Dietfried at the end. But before I knew that was a possibility, I considered a story where Gilbert was found alive. And I thought the twist might be that just when Violet got a hold on her emotions, she'd find Gilbert, maybe hospitalized somewhat permanently, so traumatized by his time in the war that now he's the one who can't connect with anyone. And they could have gotten their happy ending through Violet repaying his kindness and teaching him how to feel again. I'm skeptical about a storyline where Gilbert lives, now that it's been so established that everyone who knew and loved him genuinely believed him to be dead. There are things about a reappearance now that just don't make sense. But I always hope I'm wrong. I guess technically I can't even say for sure that it was Gilbert at the door. I just can't think of any possible other client who would have elicited that response. But all I can do now is further speculation, so it's time to cut this off. I'm excited to see what the movies will bring to this tale. Thank you for watching.